Hello, Christ our King. I am honored to be able to share with you on behalf of the Kingdom Thinking team another person that has been monumental in Black history, a woman of the movement, and that is that of Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. Mrs. Hamer was born October 6, 1917, in Montgomery County, Mississippi. She was the youngest of 20 children, born to a family of sharecroppers, and began to help her family in the cotton fields at the age of 6. And in the 40s, she married Perry Hamer, also known as Pap, and she worked with him at another plantation owned by W.D. Marlowe. They adopted two daughters, and in 1961, Mrs. Hamer went into the hospital for a routine minor procedure and was sterilized without consent or her knowledge. In 1962, Mrs. Hamer's friend Mary Tucker, just told her it is our right to be able to register to vote. And this was her first time hearing this. So as a result, she attended a student nonviolent coordinating committee meeting, which we know is SNCC. And her and 17 others ended up traveling on a bus to the county seat to try and register to vote. Now, most of them were blocked to vote except for Mrs. Hamer and one other man. So they were given applications and were allowed to take a literacy test, which they both failed. On the drive back, the bus was stopped. The driver was arrested because the bus was too yellow. It was a bus. Well, Mrs. Hamer on the bus, many would remember her singing hymns such as "This Little Light of Mine," "Go Tell It on the Mountain," which seemed to calm them down. And the passengers eventually gathered enough money to pay the fine for the bus driver, and the bus was allowed to return. Now, the plantation owner, W.D. Marlowe, caught wind of this, caught wind that she had gone down to try and register to vote. And Mrs. Hamer, basically said, she didn't mean any disrespect, but I didn't go down there to vote for him. I went down there to register, not to vote for him, but to register. I didn't go to register for him. I went to register for myself. So anyway, she was ordered off the land. As a result, he demanded that she withdraw her application. She refused, and she had to leave. So she left her family behind and stayed with friends for a while. And of course, her friend Mary Tucker was one of those friends, and her husband Pap just, had this, felt like something was wrong, and picked her up, moved her to another location. And that night, Mary Tucker's house was shot 16 times. So thankfully, he was obedient and did that. Now, the SNCC field secretary at the time, Bob Moses, saw Fannie Lou Hamer as a leader and sent for her so that she could be a part of the conference, the SNCC conference in Nashville in 1962. Now, Pat, let me go back to him. He stayed on the plantation throughout harvest and joined his family in the fall. Marlowe took the car, took everything in the house. So they had to start all over again, and they were living off of Mrs. Hamer's $10 a week stipend from SNCC. So throughout 1962 and 1963, Mrs. Hamer continued to work for desegregation and voter registration, did some relief work, distributed food and clothes, and even at times used that as leverage. So you got to register to vote if you're going to be a part of receiving these items. So she was able to do that. Now, in June of 1963, June 9th to be exact, Mrs. Hamer and other activists were on the way back from a conference in South Carolina when the bus stopped in Winona, Mississippi. And some of the delegates decided to sit at the whites only lunch counter. Well, of course, the police came in and removed them, arrested 6 of them. They were taken to jail. The police beat several of them and even ordered some of the other Black inmates to beat them, or gave them blackjacks to beat them endlessly. And Mrs. Hamer suffered blood clots to her right eye, suffered kidney injury. Her legs were injured, and you can imagine the other injuries to her body, which affected her for the rest of her life. The group was finally released on June 12th. And they learned after their release that Medgar Evers had been assassinated on the front steps of his house there in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, Mrs. Hamer was known also too as one of the founders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged the pro-segregation Democratic Party. In 1964, she ran for Congress as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party candidate, and the challenger won, but this set the stage for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to have a national presence. She would travel and train volunteers who would be teaching classes and registering people to vote. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, continued to hold conventions at the precinct level, at the county, at the state level, in order to select a group of delegates that would go on to attend the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City in August of 1964. They would challenge the seating of this all-white Mississippi delegates there, and Mrs. Hamer was elected as the vice chair. And they had an integrated group of 64 black delegates and 4 white delegates there. Now, the president at the time, President Lyndon Johnson, needed the Southern Democratic support for his bid for reelection, and he was determined to block them. During Hamer's testimony before the Credentials Committee at the convention, he called the last-minute press conference, and which caused the broadcast to cut away to the White House and to break the convention coverage and broadcast his last-minute press conference instead. So, by the way, the Mississippi Democratic delegation and the white supremacists supported Barry Goldwater, who is the current Republican nominee. Many networks broadcasted Mrs. Hamer's testimony on their evening news, which, again, in this case, gave more people the opportunity to be able to watch because it was their evening news. When Mrs. Hamer testified, she spoke of her eviction from the Marlowe plantation. She spoke about her brutal beating in jail, and all because they simply wanted to register to vote. Now, behind the scenes, President Johnson he convinced the committee to only allow 2 at-large seats to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which they didn't accept that. But Hubert Humphrey at the time made it clear that he didn't even want Mrs. Hamer to have one of those seats. So Mrs. Hamer eventually joined the SNCC activists on a trip to Africa, where she had never seen Black people running banks, had never seen so many Black people in positions in government. And so after the 1964 elections, she traveled to DC with a group of ladies, and this was the first group of Black women to be seated on the House floor. Mrs. Hamer continued to participate in many speaking engagements. She took the lead in lawsuits that led to the first elections in her area of where the largest number of Black residents were able to register and were eligible to vote in 1967. She organized plaintiffs for school desegregation lawsuits, and she purchased land for housing. She was involved in the introduction of a Head Start program. And in 1969, she was a founder of the Freedom Farm Cooperative. And it was a co-op, $1 a month per family. Only 30 families were able to afford it, but 1,500 by name that were part of this co-op. They raised some cash crops such as soybeans and cotton, and also to produce other vegetables, which were given to the families that were part of this co-op. She didn't want anyone to ever know what it was like to be hungry. So eventually this organization started a pig bank. It started with 35 female pigs, 5 male pigs, and after about 3 years, thousands of pigs were produced in order to feed these families. Mrs. Hamer received a cancer diagnosis in 1976. And at the age of 59, on March 4th, 1977, she passed as a result of complications of heart disease and cancer. Now, there were several familiar people who spoke in celebration of Mrs. Hamer's contribution, including Stokely Carmichael of SNCC, Ella Baker, whom we heard about last week of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Dorothy Height and others. She's buried on her own land, did not have any desire, asked to be promised not to be buried on a plantation. Her tombstone is inscribed with her famous quote, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." And that It's Fannie Lou Hamer, just in this little bit.